This is my video assignment for Professor Tristan Hassell's ethics class. My topic is it morally permissible to use human embryos to conduct stem cell research? My first philosopher is Jeremy Bentham. This video might be a little long. I'm not sure yet, but feel free to take a break if you don't want to watch all of it. I'll probably take breaks to catch my breath, because it's a lot of talking. Alright. An act that is morally permissible will have an outcome that provides the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. To determine the amount of pleasure that will be produced, and the means to produce said pleasure, a principle of utility is needed. Utility is defined as a property of an object that produces benefit, advantage, good, pleasure, or happiness, or that prevents mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. 7 forms of measurement make up the principle of utility, which are listed below. Intensity is how strong the pleasure will be for an individual or group of people. Duration is how long the continuous pleasure will last for an individual or group of people. Certainty or uncertainty is how likely or how unlikely the said pleasure will occur. Propinquity or remoteness is how soon the said pleasure will occur. Fecundity is the probability that the action being questioned will have similar sensations following it. Purity is the probability that the action being questioned will not have similar sensations following it. Extent is the amount of people who will be affected by this pleasure. Stem cell research is a type of research conducted by extracting stem cells, and said stem cells can be extracted from living human embryos. Extracting the stem cells necessitates destruction of the embryo. Stem cells are cells which most of the tissue of our body in our body originates from. An embryo is an unborn or unhatched child, which is in the 2nd to 8th week of development. Stem cells are used in research to help find treatments for diseases. Stem cell research is an issue because embryos are destroyed during the process of extracting cells. If extracting stem cells produces the greatest pleasure for the greatest amount of people after factoring in the principle of utility, it is morally permissible. When factoring in the principle of utility, we must consider the extent of the action and who will be affected by said action. The individuals receiving the treatments will be affected the most, as well as the researchers who are conducting research and experimenting on the cells. The researchers are affected positively because they are furthering their research on stem cells. The researchers are affected negatively because they are destroying an embryo. Parents will not be affected due to these embryos being left over from in vitro fertilization attempts. Patients will be affected positively because they will be treated. In vitro fertilization is a type of fertilization where a mature egg is taken from a woman and fertilized by sperm in a lab, and then the fertilized egg is implanted into the uterus. Jeremy Bentham would believe that conducting stem cell research using human embryos is morally permissible because it produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, as shown in premises 20 through 24. 20 being talking about the individuals receiving the treatments, and all the way to 24 talking about how the patient will be affected positively. And that is my first one. Got my jasmine tea. My next argument is Immanuel Kant. And Kant is a yes. Persons must treat persons as persons while acting in accordance with the categorical imperative. A person is a rational being and must have minimal moral sense as well as an autonomous will. A rational being is able to think, form judgment from logic, and understand things. Moral sense is the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Autonomous will is the will that is free. The categorical imperative is an unconditional moral obligation that is binding in all circumstances and is not dependent on a person's inclination or purpose. The categorical imperative states that we must treat persons as ends and not as means to an end. We must also act in a way that our actions would be acceptable if everyone were to do said action. And my example is, if we hit a dog, then it must be okay for everyone to hit their dog. But it's not. Stem cell research is the research conducted by extracting stem cells from human embryos. Extracting the stem cells from the embryo necessitates the destruction of the embryo. An embryo is a human which is unhatched or unborn and can range from the 2nd to 8th week after fertilization. Stem cells are cells that make up most of the tissue in our body. An embryo does not have an autonomous will. An embryo does not have a minimal moral sense. An embryo is not a rational being because it cannot think and make judgments. With this logic, we can conclude that an embryo is not a person. Since an embryo is not a person, there is no personhood to be taken away from destroying it. Since the embryo is not a person, we can treat the embryo as a means to an end instead of an end. If an embryo does not meet all of the qualifications to be a person, then it is not a person. If embryos are not persons, then Immanuel Kant would believe that conducting stem cell research using human embryos is morally permissible. Two to go. So, my third one is... My last two are my no's. So, this one is Hare. And as I said, it is a no. When deciding what we must do, we must take preferences into account. Preferences being the interests of people. We must act to fulfill the preferences of the agents that are involved. The agents being the people who are involved. There are 3 types of preferences we must consider before taking an action. The first one is now for them preferences, and they take into account what effect the action will have in the future. Next is external preference, and external preference is a preference that is out of the agent's control. And this last one is uninformed preference. Subjects may have a higher level preference where they hold or lack a lower level preference only out of ignorance. Its presence or absence should be discounted. The thought perhaps only so long as it does not give rise to a denial of autonomy within spheres where each of us expects to be free to act at will according to his own judgment. If I do not feel the preference with the intensity which the person in the situation feels it, I have not fully represented his situation to myself. We must take into account the preferences of possible people before taking an action. Possible people are people who can exist in the future if we make them exist. Example, an embryo. Stem cell research is research conducted by extracting stem cells from human embryos. Extracting the stem cells from the human embryo necessitates the destruction of the embryo. An embryo is a human which is unhatched or unborn and can range from the 2nd to 8th week after fertilization. Stem cells are cells that make up most of the tissue in our body. Human embryos do not have preferences. Human embryos can have preferences if we bring them into existence in the future. Human embryos are possible people due to the fact that they do not have preferences now, since they are not fully developed, but have the potential to develop into a person and preferences. Since human embryos are possible people, destroying the embryo when extracting stem cells would be morally impermissible, as it does not fulfill the possible preferences of the possible person. If human embryos are possible people and we must fulfill the preferences of everyone involved, even possible people, I believe Richard Mervyn Hare would say that using human embryos to conduct stem cell research is morally impermissible. And just to make sure I did all of them, Bentham, Kant, Hare, and my last one is Nozick. I believe his first name is, I think it's Robert. Anyway, that's besides the point. I say Nozick is no, as I said before. Individuals have natural rights which are inalienable. Individuals are autonomous beings with autonomous will. Natural rights are those which we inherit from birth. These natural rights entitle us to private property, freedom, and autonomy. Inalienable describes something that cannot be taken from the owner or given away by the owner, like rights. If we would commit an act that would strip away a person's natural rights, that act would be morally permissible. An example of that would be something such as slavery, because you're taking away someone's autonomous will, well, free will. We are our own property, according to Nozick, which means we have control over what actions to take and what to do to ourselves. We may not use other persons as means to ends without the person's consent. Individuals are inviolable. Inviolable meaning never to be broken, infringed, or dishonored. Stem cell research is a type of research conducted by extracting stem cells, and said stem cells can be extracted from living human embryos. Extracting the stem cells necessitates destruction of the embryo. Stem cells are cells which most of the tissue in our body originates from. An embryo is an unborn or unhatched child which is in the 2nd to 8th week of development. With the logic of premise 2, which reads, individuals are autonomous beings with autonomous will, since embryos are not rational beings, they are not persons, meaning they do not have natural rights. The embryos which are used are left over from in vitro fertilization attempts. In vitro fertilization is a method of fertilization where eggs are extracted from a woman, fertilized, and then placed into the uterus. If these embryos' eggs, meaning the eggs that the embryos develop from, come from a woman, the embryos that develop from her eggs, oh, I guess I put that there. Let me restart that premise. If these embryos' eggs come from a woman, the embryos that develop from her eggs are hers even if they change form, meaning develop. If this is the case, the leftover embryos and eggs are the property of the woman. In the case that a release was not signed, the eggs and embryos are still the property of the woman. Therefore, if no release was signed and these embryos were used for something else, such as research, and were destroyed, that would violate natural rights. Thus, Nozick would believe that stem cell research using human embryos is an act that is morally impermissible. And that is the end of my assignment. I'd love to hear feedback so I can reply and get credit. And other than that, that is it.